Welcome to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the story behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company may be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, app developer, and long-time Apple user.
And I'm Charlie Sorrell, a technology journalist and content creator. You can keep that in.
Charlie, the use of that word there, maybe we need to unpack that before we continue, because we're going to be talking about content a lot today, and I know you have strong views on the subject.
Yeah, I mean, content is a word with meaning, but it's become used for so much that it's really lost its meaning and tends to belittle the work. So if you're talking in marketing terms, that's fine. Or if you're talking about the design of the web page, then that's fine. It's like, here's the framework of the page, here's the content that we're showing. But when it comes to an actual person,
the content creator.
But they're not. Because, when it comes to actually what you're making, a musician makes music, movie maker makes films, movies. Saying everything is content, it just means you don't know what you're talking about. It's a lack of specificity, which in writing is bad. If you start referring to your creations, your work, your art, maybe your craft, as content, you're just referring to your creations as just other interchangeable widgets of content. If you start referring to your creations in those terms, you belittle it. You make it seem interchangeable widgets to fill up the vending machine. That's why I don't like it.
Okay, well, firstly, apologies. We've been away for so long. And the reason is I've been super busy these last 6 months working on a new app, Reps and Sets, which I'll tell you a little bit more about at the end of the show. But if you're interested, you'll find a link to that app in the show notes. But we're back now. I've finished the app and we have big plans for a new season. This is the first episode of season 2 of Apple Core. And our topic today is rather meta. We're going to do a podcast about podcasts. In this podcast, we're going to talk about the Apple app podcasts, and we're going to talk more generally about the history of podcasting and how it's closely intertwined with the history of Apple. So Apple Podcasts is one of the world's most popular podcast players with almost 25% market share. The app launched in 2012, but Apple's support for podcasting goes back much further. In this episode, we explore the fascinating story of how podcasting emerged at a time when Apple embraced and promoted open standards. We consider how Apple's focus has shifted to proprietary technology over the years and where this leaves Apple Podcasts today. So, Charlie, what do you make of that? You got any high-level thoughts before we dive in?
Oh, I've got lots to say about it. The main thing is how podcasting has become to mean a lot more than just a podcast. It has a specific technical definition. It's an RSS feed. Is it called with enclosures?
That's right, yeah.
The enclosure in this case is an audio file,
yeah,
usually an MP3. And that's it. When you subscribe, Apple's podcast app, any podcatcher app is an RSS reader. And it does what any RSS reader does, goes out on a regular basis, checks for new feeds, and then if it finds one, it downloads the episode. And their point is, it happens automatically. So when there's a new episode available, it shows up quickly. Downloads it and it's ready to go, and you can just go off and listen. But podcasts have now come to be used to really refer to any audio or video. And that's not a podcast. That's an audio or a video stream. I mean, it doesn't matter, but it's just, if we're talking about podcasts, we should be clear on what podcasts are.
That's absolutely right. And it was one of the things I definitely wanted to get into, that the term podcasting has become a bit corrupted. I would say it's sort of generally used for any kind of internet broadcasting now, however that is done. But that's not really what it means. And I think this is the same as in the aughts, people started to use the web and the internet as interchangeable terms, which of course they're not. And the fact that people were using them wrong didn't actually change their definition. To me, that's true with podcasting as well. It's absolutely true that it is sometimes used more broadly to describe any kind of internet broadcasting, but that isn't really what it is. And so for this episode, when we talk about podcasting, that's what we're going to talk about, is subscribing to an RSS feed of podcasts. It's interesting that you got into the definition there, Charlie, because that was going to be my first teaser question. So that one's a big tick. But I have a follow-on teaser question, which is, what does RSS stand for?
It can be real simple syndication, or it can be, there's another term for it as well, which I forget now.
Well, I would say RSS these days means really simple syndication rather than real simple.
Okay, well, that's...
real simple, it makes you sound like someone from the Wild West. It's real simple, kid.
You don't want to hear my accent.
Okay, so RSS came to stand for really simple syndication, but originally when it was developed, it stood for RDF Site Summary. And do you know what RDF stands for?
I used to know, but no, I don't know anymore.
Yeah, because it's arcane. It's not used so much anymore, but Resource Description Framework was RDF. So RSS originally stood for RDF Site Summary, and then it came to mean Rich Site Summary. It was that when it was first developed, that was what it stood for. And then later, as we'll tell the story, it became really simple syndication. But that brings me on to the next teaser question, which is, what is syndication?
Syndication means that a newspaper cartoon like Nancy or The Terrible Garfield is made available. You sell it into lots of different newspapers. So, all those local newspapers don't have their own cartoons. They just use the syndicated cartoons. Or with a news agency, like Reuters news agency, they syndicate their stories.
When you think about it, podcasting is using RSS, but I would say it's not syndication because it's not like Apple Core is syndicated to Spotify and syndicated to Apple Podcasts. The technology has the word syndication in because it was developed for a very different purpose to the way that it's used now. And now I have one final teaser question for you, Charlie. And this one I think is impossible, but you'll blow my mind if you get it because there's no way I would have got this. But it's something I came across in my research, which is, what was Apple's hot sauce?
Podcast.
So this is a product of the Apple Advanced Research Group, and it was called Hot Sauce, and it was a precursor to RSS. So this was in the 90s, before the return of Steve Jobs. Apple was in its wilderness years, where it was doing a lot of really crazy things, some of them very innovative and visionary and ahead of their time, but almost none of them that were actually commercially useful to keep the company going. And one of these interesting research projects was Apple Hot Sauce. And this was based on something called the Meta Content Framework. And it was a way to summarize the content of web pages. And it did this in a really bizarre way. If you look in the podcast player now, you can see an image of it. But it was a way of summarizing the content of a web page in QuickTime VR. So you could see like a summary of the web page in 3D.
Oh, wow. Hot Sauce is such a 90s web name now.
So, okay, are you ready to get into it?
Yeah, ready.
As we usually do, I'm going to start by setting the scene. The year is 2005. James Blunt thought we were beautiful. Fergie got us spending on her humps. And Mariah Carey thought we belonged together. At the movies, the Sith were taking their revenge in Star Wars Episode 3, and Brokeback Mountain was delighting Fujoshis everywhere. Meanwhile, on the small screen, Supernatural was kicking off its 15-year epic run. Some people were attempting to use the internet to deliver radio, but this was mostly unsuccessful, or at least unpopular, because you needed a PC to access the internet, and modem speeds were slow, even for downloading audio files. At Apple, Steve Jobs has successfully engineered a full-scale turnaround. The success of iPod and iTunes had given Apple a brand new sheen, and Mac sales were finally starting to take off thanks to the halo effect. But the best was still to come, with the switch to Intel processors 1 year later and the iPhone still 3 years away. Do you have fond recollections of this time, Charlie?
I do. I had an iPod, the worst of the iPods, the one which had the buttons in they were touch buttons and they were in little recessed circles along the top.
Oh, yeah.
It looked very cool because they were surrounded by red. It looked amazing. And I listened to, this is probably going to be a spoiler on what you're going to say. But I started listening to podcasts. I lived in London at the time, and I started listening to the Daily Source Code which we're probably going to get to.
We are going to get into.
Which I think was the first podcast of maybe, but between that and...
Put a pin in that, because we're definitely going to want to unpack your early recollections of the Daily Source Code.
Okay, so we'll come back to that?
Yes. So I'm going to break this into 3 parts. Part 1, we're going to go back in time to the 1990s and look at the history of push technology, which is where podcasting came from. Mm-hmm. Then part 2, we're going to look at Dave Weiner, Adam Curry, and the emergence of podcasting. So Adam Curry, Charlie, I think you're going to tell us about in terms of the Daily Source Code pioneering first podcast. And then in part 3, we're going to look at how Apple entered the scene, how they changed the scene. And then we're going to wind up with where we're at today and what Apple is doing with podcasting and the good, the bad, and the ugly of that. So, part one, push. What, Charlie, do you know about push technology? And I'm talking about the way that people used to think about push in the 90s. Do you remember when that was a buzz term? Kind of like now we talk about stuff like AI as a buzz term, but in the 90s, push was a buzz term. What did people mean by that?
Well, push would be, okay, so let's take a more modern thing as an example, like notifications, push notifications.
Yeah.
So the idea is that you have a server somewhere or a service can push content to your device.
You said the C word first.
I did, but it's, I think in this case, it's the actual correct term to use.
And I think the reason why there was a lot of buzz around push was not so much driven from users as it was driven by big media companies. And the reason for this was the internet was quite a threatening technology. They felt threatened by it, and rightly so, because the internet was very much a pull technology. The internet enabled consumers to browse the web, download what they wanted. It put consumers in control. That seems like a strange idea now, but you have to remember what the media landscape was like back in the 1990s. So in the UK, I think we just had 4 TV channels. We had BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, and Channel 4. And I think sometime in the 90s, they added Channel 5. And in the US, it was a similar situation. They had ABC, CBS, NBC, and then later they added Fox. So there were just these 4 big channels. And then sure, cable came along in the US, and in the UK, it was more like satellite TV. And that added quite a few more channels. In the end, it maybe added 80 more channels. But there's a difference between 80 channels versus millions of web pages. It's a very different media landscape. What I think these big media companies saw happening that was very threatening to them is they had paid to own media that gave them a chunk of consumers' attention. And they foresaw correctly, as it turns out, that what the internet was going to do was fracture consumers' attention. These big media owners, they spent a lot on their network broadcasting licenses. If you are ABC, NBC, CBS, you're going to jealously guard that virtual monopoly that you've got on people's attention. There wasn't much hope for them. But the thing that they clung on to was this idea of push technology. So what was push technology? From a technology perspective, you'd have some listener that would listen for when something changed on a server, and then when there was that change, you would pull it. What would you do with this? Well, do you remember something called Pointcast?
It rings a bell. I can't remember what it was, though.
So Pointcast was one of the really early pioneers of push, and it was just a screensaver. I mean, do you even remember screensavers? They were a thing in the 1990s.
Don't you use screensavers? I know you don't have one on your computer, but you run one on your big TV.
You don't need screensavers these days because we don't use CRT displays anymore, so that you don't get burn-in. Or maybe you do get burn-in with these new...
OLED gets burnt in.
Yeah, but this was to protect burn-in on CRT displays. Your computer would start showing an animation on the screen. You don't want to leave static pixels on the screen for any amount of time because they would eventually burn into the phosphor of the CRT. So Pointcast was a screensaver that would use push technology to push news stories onto your screen when your computer was asleep. And that's all that it was.
Like a news ticker. That's actually kind of cool.
Well, it is kind of cool, but it was maybe one of the first internet bubbles was the push internet bubble. Pointcast was seen as the answer. Finally, someone's found a way that we can make the internet like traditional media and we can push information.
Push ads.
To the consumer. And at one point, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp was on the edge of buying Pointcast for between $350 and $450 million.
That was a lot at the time, no?
That was a huge amount at the time. That didn't go through, I think, because Pointcast thought they were worth more than that.
Silly billies.
But the reason that I share that Pointcast example is because I think it illustrates just how important people thought push was at the time. And Microsoft was in on the act as well. Do you remember Active Desktop?
I do.
So tell us about Active Desktop.
Oh, I don't remember it that well.
Oh, okay. So Microsoft was a media owner as well. They had MSN, their portal, and they had a deal with NBC for their news channel, MSNBC. And so they had an interest in trying to make push happen too. And their solution was Active Desktop. It was a sort of extension of Internet Explorer so that you could take web content and embed it on the desktop of your Windows PC so that your desktop would be constantly updating with news feeds, weather, cartoons, and bits of Disney content. Interestingly, it wasn't necessarily the wrong idea because that's kind of what you have on today's iPhones and Android phones. You can turn an app icon into a widget and it auto-updates with push information.
We don't really think of a difference between what's on our phones or computers and what's on the internet. So yeah, if you have a live view widget showing you your countdown timer, and you might have one also with showing you your sports results, and we don't really think of them as different in terms of, where the information comes from. It's just, they're telling us different things.
Yeah.
With that kind of barrier between online and offline is likely disappeared in many ways, in the way we think about it.
Yeah, it's true. I think what was wrong in the 1990s was the framing of it, that this was going to save the internet from being pull. It's actually both, isn't it? People want updates pushed to their screen, but they're also still going to pull the information they want off the internet as well. Mm-hmm. I think where the framing was wrong is, no, media owners, you're not going to save yourselves from oblivion by changing the internet from pull to push. But there was a lot of value in this push technology.
No, they'd have to be saved they would have to wait for magazines and newspapers on the iPad.
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
So many false dawns for trying to save the old media model. It's true. Yeah. So in 1999, Netscape developed RSS, and its original intention, much like Apple's hot source that we looked at earlier, was as a way of summarizing web pages. And the way that it was supposed to work is they introduced what they called a portal. And portals were a big idea in the late 90s. You would have these aggregator web pages that would have information from lots of different sources all on the one page.
Yahoo was both a search engine and a portal.
Yes.
I mean, it was a portal that you could search it.
A bit like Active Desktop. You'd see all these different widgets. You could even configure the portal to show the different feeds that you want. And they called that my.netscape.com. The way in which, if you were a media owner, you could get your content on my.netscape.com was to use this RSS technology so that you could syndicate content, just like Garfield is syndicated to appear in local newspapers.
I didn't really know we were going to be talking about Garfield so much today.
It didn't really work. I mean, people didn't want portals. I mean, did you ever find portals useful, Charlie? Did you use portals?
No, not really. I mean, it's handy maybe to have the weather when you went to a search page.
Yeah.
But I didn't use a portal. I used Yahoo and it had things around it. And of course, being a nerd, I would configure it.
Yeah.
Because if I could, then I would. But no, never. I never found it particularly useful.
It didn't really take off, this idea of portals, but I think you could draw a clear line from that to something like Apple's dashboard that they introduced a couple of years later in macOS 10, which is essentially the same kind of thing, but it's in the OS rather than a web page.
Bring back dashboard, I say.
I have very fond recollections of dashboard, and we're definitely going to do a dashboard episode. So the underlying technology that Netscape developed for its My Netscape portal was RSS. And although My Netscape never took off, RSS continued. And one of the reasons is because it was adopted by a guy called Dave Weiner.
Wait, so Dave Weiner didn't invent RSS?
He didn't invent RSS. No, Netscape invented RSS.
I didn't know that. I always thought he'd invented it.
You touched on earlier this idea of enclosures, which is how RSS is used to deliver podcast audio. And that's the bit that Dave Weiner came up with and added to the RSS spec. While Netscape was still developing RSS, they adopted lots of Dave Weiner's ideas.
He's an idea factory, that man.
He really is. And so he was very influential in the development of RSS. And when Netscape scrapped it, he took it over. Do you remember Safari RSS, Charlie?
I do. If a web page had an RSS feed, which is pretty much every blog or news site, even today, then a little RSS badge would appear in the URL bar of Safari. I think it was a little blue one, blue badge. And you clicked on that, and then the page would morph to show you article summaries of all the articles available in the RSS feed. So it's like using Google Reader or NetNewsWire or whichever RSS reader you use. But it was built into the browser. It was not that useful because you had to go to the web page for it. Although I think there was a way of having it in the sidebar that it would show you when there were new things available, but you still had to go to the web page to see them.
You could search your RSS feeds that you were following, and you could get search results aggregated from all the different RSS that you were following on Safari.
Yeah, and it stuck around. Apple didn't really do much with it, but it stuck around for surprisingly long time, I think, before they got rid of it.
It did. So it was introduced 5 years after the demise of Netscape as part of macOS 10 Tiger 10.4. I'm going to send you a quote, Charlie.
Oh, yeah.
This is Steve Jobs at the WWDC keynote when he introduced macOS 10 Tiger. And this is how he described RSS.
There's a new thing happening on the web that most of you know about called RSS, which stands for Really Simple Syndication. This is how web blogs are published, and there are a lot of RSS feeds now on really popular websites. What this is you go to a website, let's say you go to Apple's website, Hot News, and you see stories there. Well, in addition to watching them in a web browser, Apple, along with a bunch of other sites, offers an RSS feed where you can get all that data of that website and format it any way you want and search it any way you want.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of describing RSS. What do you make of that?
I think that describes the Safari RSS service, really. It touches on what RSS does, but it's like saying that email is something that you can search and format any way you want. It's like, well, it's true, but that's not really the point of email.
That's RSS. And at this point, you might be thinking, well, I thought we were going to be talking about podcasts. Why have we talked so much about RSS? And there was
Yeah, Graham.
Yeah, like get with the
Come
program,
on.
get back on topic. Well, there was a clue actually in this keynote that Steve Jobs gave at WWDC when he introduced Safari RSS. One of the things that he demoed was he said that iTunes had an RSS feed. And so you could look at the top 10 songs on iTunes in RSS in Safari. And he then clicked on and played a Maroon 5 song. So whilst RSS was originally conceived more like taking text content from web pages and repurposing it so it can appear in other web pages and in other formats, Steve Jobs showed that it could also be used for subscribing to a feed of audio content. In this instance, that feed was the top 10 iTunes songs. And that was very much a hint of things to come. And it's where we're diving into next as we enter part 2, Dave Weiner, Adam Curry, and the emergence of podcasting. So we've touched on Dave Weiner a bit, Charlie, and I was curious because he used to be a writer for Hotwired, which was part of Wired. So I wondered if you'd ever come across him.
No, never. I think maybe that was before I was at Wired. I started there in 2005 or 7. I can never remember which one it was, at the Gadget Lab. But so I spoke to some people. That's where I met Leander. He was briefly my editor.
Leander Carney from Cult of Mac, a friend of the show.
Yeah, well, exactly. And when Cult of Mac was also part of the Wired blog.
It's funny you mentioned that because Cult of Mac was at the time a blog on Wired.com. And Dave Weiner had a blog as well. Do you remember what it was called? His Wired blog. It has a really terrible name.
Tell me.
DaveNet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very 90s now. It's like Craigslist. A DaveNet sounds like something that men who care about their hair wear when they're in bed.
It's a man net.
Yeah.
I've got like a mission statement for DaveNet here that appeared in the header at the top of the page, and I'm going to share it with you to read because it made me smile.
Dave Weiner likes to have fun. Okay, I'll take issue with that at the beginning. I don't know if that's true. He likes to argue. Dave Weiner likes to have fun. And one way he has fun is writing essays about computer platforms, sex roles, processor chips, and Aretha Franklin on DaveNet, an influential salon for the digital cognoscenti, a mediated forum for lofty, brackets but playful, big picture discussions about computer industry, dynamics, music, or anything else that piques Dave's curiosity. That was difficult to read?
It was difficult to read in multiple ways.
I love that Aretha Franklin's just in the middle there.
It's a bit random. I think that would have been a bit random.
I'm always happy to have Aretha Franklin mentioned, but I wasn't expecting it.
It made me smile when I came across that. Blogging was a different world back in the 1990s. And it's true to say that his blog, DaveNet, was read by the cognoscenti. Noted readers of DaveNet were Bill Gates and Apple CEO at the time, Michael Spindler. I think when you look at Weiner's career, there's one through line which you can see very clearly, which is a focus on publishing solutions, content automation, and syndication.
And very specifically with the control of the user.
Right. So Dave was born in Queens, New York in 1955 to academic parents. He graduated from the Bronx High School of Science in 1972 and studied maths and computer science at university. His early work on an outliner app for the Apple II and the Mac. Charlie, what do you know of outliner apps?
Yeah, outliner apps are apps where you You write lists, but you can nest those lists and you can hide the subsections with a little disclosure triangle.
He got out of the outliner business at exactly the right time. He sold his outliner app to Symantec for quite a lot of money, unlike the folks at
Pointcast.
Yeah, Pointcast. Yeah, he got out when the going was good. And he founded this new company, Userland. Interestingly, do you know who he recruited as a couple of like well-known board directors to Userland?
No.
One noted Apple luminary and enemy of Steve Jobs, Jean-Louis Gasset.
Ah.
He was one of the board directors of Userland. He joined from Apple, and Robert Scoble as well.
Oh, really? Oh, Scoble.
So what can you tell us about Robert Scoble?
Imagine somebody who wants to be online all the time, like today's influencers, except a middle-aged man in a who looks like he should be on a dress down Friday at Microsoft. That's Robert Scoble.
Userland, it's not a famous brand today, but it did at this time play a really important role. Its scripting tool for the Mac was used by a lot of the desktop publishing industry in order to automate desktop publishing workflows, which were really emerging at the time. And this was before AppleScript came along. So it was a really early and popular solution for desktop automation. So Userland took up RSS when Netscape abandoned it. Some of Dave Weiner's clients at this time were doing audio blogging. And so audio blogging is like a precursor to podcasting. It basically is podcasting, but without the RSS bit. So these customers were wanting Weiner to find a way to enable them to use RSS to share their audio blogs. And you can see where we're going with this, because what I've just described is podcasting, right?
It's right there.
It's right there. Dave Weiner introduced this idea of enclosures. You could enclose or attach an audio file to an RSS story so that rather than the text being the thing, the text is the show notes for the audio file that's enclosed with it. It still wasn't quite podcasting because there was a missing link. What this enabled you to do was people could subscribe to audio blogs and get the audio file downloaded to their Mac or PC, but it didn't automatically get it onto their iPod. The way that you got your music onto an iPod was with iTunes on your desktop. It wasn't easy for any third party to create a really nice solution that would sync these MP3 files that you downloaded from an audio blog to your iPod. You could do it, but there wasn't really a good way of doing it.
The way I first put podcasts onto my iPod was using an Apple script, which would check the RSS feed, download the enclosures, and then add them to playlists in iTunes. And then you would sync your iPod before you left the house.
So you were actually that, which means that if you were using podcasting before Apple supported podcasting, you were like one of the early pioneers of the podcasting revolution.
I was super into it. And I had a meeting with an editor of a design magazine where a friend of mine worked at the time. And I spent the meeting telling them that they should do podcasting and get into that, because they were doing online publishing as well. And they just, I don't know, they didn't know what the hell I was talking about. They didn't think it was a very good idea. So I was like, okay, maybe it was 15 years too early, but you know.
I mean, that's exactly where it was. At this time, 2004, it had been invented and it had so much potential and promise.
You could just see it was going to be
You
huge.
could see it, but it was very niche at this point. So as we're talking about this time now, we'll get to Apple's entry in a moment, but you touched on the daily source code and Adam Curry. Mm-hmm. Adam Curry was an MTV VJ.
With amazing hair.
With amazing hair. I mean, he was a nice-looking chap back in his MTV days, I would say.
Yeah, now he just looks like every other, middle-aged man. But yeah, he was a good-looking guy, and he had great hair. He was actually, when he was in the 80s, he looked great.
Yeah, he was an MTV VJ, and they didn't hire them unless they looked good.
No, and were very confident. And he was a very confident gentleman. So, yeah, I don't know how he got talking to Dave Weiner. He had some technology company which he sold. So he had lots and lots of money. And he started the Daily Source Code, which may or may not be the first podcast. I mean,
certainly among them.
Yeah. And the point of that was really to just have something going out, like to talk about podcasts and how things were going with podcasting. I mean, it really was daily.
Yeah.
And as a way for people who are making scripts and things like this, or eventually applications to download podcasts, would be able to have a feed to test it on.
Exactly.
And, you know, and he could make changes to his feed. And he was talking to Dave Weiner at the time. I think they worked together and they would often chat. I think Dave Weiner, he would call in on the show. Yeah, and it was great. It was very small at the time. There were a few shows. Nerds who'd be listening to this would think, oh, wait, I could do that. And then they would do it. Like there was the Dawn and Drew show. I don't know if you remember that. There were a couple who did, it was pretty dirty, their show, but it was very funny. Adam Curry, they knew each other. They would chat to each other. It was right at the beginning. It's not like now when there are a million podcasts and everyone's got one.
Yeah.
There were very few of them, so you could listen to all podcasts.
You could listen to them all, yeah. Well, you know, an interesting factoid there is when in 2005, Steve Jobs announced Apple support for podcasting, he said there are 8,000 podcasts now. That's amazing. He was positioning that as like, wow, that's a lot. But it just shows, because you go back to 2004, there were hundreds at the most. And I think when the Daily Source Code launched,
it was a handful.
It was a handful at most, for sure.
And as far as I know, Adam Curry possibly came up with the name podcast as well. He certainly popularized it.
Now that's interesting because it was a 2005 article in The Guardian. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's the first reference anyone's found to this. And I think in 2004, when this was emerging, it was still called audio blogging.
Mm-hmm.
The other Adam Curry thing I wanted to share is a really bizarre bit of text that I'm going to share with you. This is something that Adam Curry played at the start of every episode of the Daily Source Code. I don't know, this might take you back, Charlie. I'm going to give you this to read.
Oh, yeah, I do remember this. With $16 million worth of airplanes strapped to my ass and the next generation radio content in my ears, I like to think I'm flying into the future. He was, he had a pilot license, so he'd fly over to, he's Dutch, right, I think?
He's born in America, but he moved quite early to the Netherlands. And so he lived there. I think he's back in America now.
I'm not sure if he had his own plane, but he definitely used to fly, and he'd talk about it when he was on the show. So that was the airplane bit, I think.
In fact, this was one of the podcasts that Steve Jobs played when he introduced podcasting in iTunes at the WWDC in 2005. And he actually played that bit of audio, and the audience tittered at the use of the word ass.
Oh, because it's so funny. It's so funny.
And it made Steve Jobs smile, and he said, I love Adam Curry.
I imagine that they would have got on, and then at some point they would have hated each other because they're both such big egos.
Yeah, but I don't think that Tim Cook would play something which had the word ass in it on an Apple keynote now. I could be wrong, but I don't think so.
With 16 million percent of customers sat in my pocket. And
so we've set the scene here. Audio blogging was becoming podcasting. It was hard to get these audio files on an iPod because an iPod was essentially a somewhat proprietary bit of technology, and it was driven by iTunes. And so to make podcasting the seamless experience that you'd really want it to be, there was only one company that could do that, and it was the company that controlled iTunes, and that was Apple. At the start of the year, they were busily suing companies that were using the term, probably because they knew that they were developing their own podcast solution. So I think just like you, Charlie, Steve Jobs had seen audio blogging and the podcast scene and seen its potential and where it was going to go. And they realized rather than fighting it, they needed to embrace it and own it. So June 2005, WWDC, when Steve Jobs announced podcasts for iTunes, he said that there were 3 ways that you could think about what a podcast was, because remember, at this time, it was completely new. Only people like Charlie knew what it was. Most people have never even heard of podcasting. And here is the 3 things Steve Jobs said that podcasting was like.
It's like TiVo for radio, Wayne's World for radio, hottest thing going in radio.
And what do you make of those 3 things, Charlie? Is that a fair description from Steve Jobs there?
Yeah, it's a great description. Not. See what I did there? Yeah, I mean, I suppose, yeah. I mean, for radio.
Yeah, the word radio is a through line through all 3 of those things.
I sort of see where he's coming from, but kind of the point of podcasting is it wasn't radio. It was just anyone could do it. And radio really makes it seem like it's got a lot more to do with, is it PBS, or the BBC, these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't think it really captures what podcasts are.
I think you're right. In this presentation, when Steve Jobs announced podcasts for iTunes, he gave examples of the kind of podcasters that existed. And it was a list of big brands. You know, it was Disney and the BBC and PBS, and it was stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, he did also play that clip from the Daily Source Code with Adam Curry. So he was showing to some extent the way in which podcasting had the potential to democratize.
I was a bit confused by the Wayne's World reference for a second. Then I remembered Wayne's World, before it was a movie, it was a basement video show that they did, no? Or was the movie about them doing a basement video show?
Yeah, Wayne's World, that was public access TV, right? So I think that was Steve Jobs' way of alluding to the fact that there was this democratization aspect to podcasting as well. The other emphasis of radio, it rings a bit odd today, but it probably made a bit more sense in 2005 because radio back then was the only frame of reference people had for what this was. The only thing where you kind of listen to people talking was radio.
Yeah, that's true.
And I guess the TiVo was a hot thing back in 2005. And it was this idea that you could record TV shows digitally rather than onto VCR cassettes. And then it enabled you to watch your favorite TV shows when you wanted to, rather than when they were broadcast.
And skip the ads.
And skip the ads, indeed. So that is another way of thinking about radio. You might listen to the same PBS show that you would listen to on the radio, but with podcasting, you could listen to it when you wanted. And as you say, skip the ads. I've got one more Steve Jobs quote for you, Charlie. This is how he described what he was doing in introducing podcasting to iTunes.
What we're doing is we're going to make this even easier because you're not going to have to download other applications and get all sorts of stuff together to make this happen. Because we're going to build this right into iTunes and iPod. So you can subscribe to any podcast, and we're going to make it really easy.
What this was quite simply iTunes, which up until that point had only been for music. They added another tab, which was podcasts. So iTunes was providing the sync of your episodes to the iPod. And at the same time, it was enabling you to find new podcasts by creating this podcast directory. And they designed the podcast directory to look like the same 3-column design that they had for the iTunes store itself. What did you think about that, Charlie? What did you think about that approach?
Oh, I loved it. I thought it was great to have everything available and just have it so easy. Yeah, because it was a real pain before that. And I can't remember if there were other applications that I think there were applications that came out. I can't remember which ones I used, but that made it a bit easier than having to, Apple scripts that didn't always work. Yeah, having it all in iTunes where I had all my music anyway. Yeah, it made it a lot easier. When Apple did this, maybe they thought that they were just going to be using this podcast directory for their own purposes, but it went on to become, as I'm sure we'll see, the canonical podcast directory for the world. So all of the other podcast apps could access this podcast directory and use it. That's what they run on still. If you make a podcast, you're going to put it into that directory. If you don't, then people aren't going to find it. Apple maintained this directory for their own use, but because they kept it open for anybody to access, it meant that Overcast and all the other podcast apps were accessing the same directory.
Yeah.
And Apple maintained it and was a good steward of this for years and years, a long time. And they didn't seem to ever do anything with it that would either spoil it or make them money from it, which was quite interesting until they started doing things like paid subscriptions within the podcast app and things. And then things started to change a little bit, but they still maintain it now for anyone to use, right?
It does seem a little bit altruistic for Apple.
Well, that's the thing. And they did it for so long, and they kind of still do it now. I think and the fact that it was called podcasting, they never really did much with that. They didn't really push, like you said at the beginning, they tried to sue over it and didn't like it. And then they kind of let it happen. Maybe they just liked the fact that the pod was good enough. They had pod in the name, so it was already a good advertisement for the iPod. But, they haven't sold the iPod for years.
Yeah. So here's the thing. What Apple has done here, by adding podcast support to iTunes, they've embraced what is an open standard because RSS isn't an open standard that anyone could use. They're popularizing podcasting, but they're doing it in such a way that it's not necessarily proprietary. I mean, I think what Apple could have done back in 2005, but they didn't, was create their own proprietary version of podcasting that only worked with Apple's ecosystem. When I say that they could have done that, that's exactly what Spotify did. Spotify does support RSS podcasting, but they've been encouraging podcasters to upload the content directly to Spotify and make it Spotify exclusive. That's a route that Apple could have gone down in 2005. And if they had, maybe that would have killed podcasting. I don't think if Apple had done that, it's a surefire thing that it would have worked. Because Apple back in 2005 wasn't the behemoth that we know today. They were starting to have a lot of success, but they weren't a massive, dominant megacorp. They weren't even necessarily as big as Spotify is today, where it can throw its weight around. So I'm not sure that Apple could have done it. And I think is perhaps why they chose to do what they did, which was a much nicer way, that rather than trying to create their own proprietary alternative to podcasting, they embraced podcasting. And as you said, Charlie, they gave some assets to the podcasting community with their directory that other apps like Overcast still use to this day.
I wonder if it's like their classic model of if something is not your core product, then you give it away.
Right.
So the idea is that you make that particular product valueless for your competition. So maybe it wasn't sort of all altruism. Part of it is like, okay, well, if we give this away, then nobody else is going to be able to make money from it.
I think that's right. This was adding a lot of value to the iTunes, iPod ecosystem. So this is something that at the end of the day sells iPods. Steve Jobs used to talk about how he loved open source and how Apple loved standards. Part of the turnaround of the company was that they scrapped a lot of proprietary technology that Apple had to move into standard technology. So, for example, macOS 10, when they adopted that, it was built on lots of open source technology like the BSD subsystem, the Unix Mac kernel. And these things were all open source projects that they built macOS 10 on top of. And so open source and open standards had become an important way that Apple had turned the company around. And of course, open standards like the web was a way that Apple made the Mac relevant again. Because the problem was in the late 90s that no one was developing software for the Mac anymore. People were only developing apps for Windows.
If somebody sent you a file, if you were using a Mac, people would say, "Oh, I don't know if it's going to work."
Yeah.
Or don't send me that from your Mac because it's not going to open on my PC. And so you had to, even if it was stuff from Microsoft from the same company, it didn't always work.
Exactly.
And so like the web, when things went on the web, and it was, an equal platform for everybody.
Apple had embraced open standards and interoperability because it made the Mac relevant again. For Steve Jobs, open standards were almost an unqualified good thing that had done great things for Apple. Mm-hmm. So when Steve Jobs looks at this emerging scene that, Charlie, you were a part of the early podcasting scene with these Apple scripts and RSS, what he saw was another emerging standard that could also be great for Apple in the same way that the web had been. So they embraced it and didn't ruin it. Mm-hmm. Would the Apple of today made the same move, or would they have made more of a Spotify move and tried to make podcasts more proprietary?
It's interesting. I was thinking about that a moment ago. You said that the original design was very much like the iTunes music store.
Yeah.
And now it's the way podcasting works is very much like the App Store in a way. It's like you can give your podcast away for free and, you don't. And then more recently, they added the ability to charge for podcasts. And that really works on that App Store model, no? Because Apple takes its cut of your subscription. And it's all handled through the way you pay for everything on your phone.
Yeah.
Apple's definitely now turned podcasts into something that works for it in the way that it sees everything as,
It's interesting you touched on subscriptions. If we refer back to our definition of podcasting at the top of the show, those subscriptions are arguably not podcasts. They appear in the Apple Podcast app, but they're not delivered via an RSS feed.
Are they not?
As a podcaster, you have to upload them to Podcast Connect, Apple's podcasting platform. The premium episodes you sell don't go into your normal RSS feed.
So that's a bit like Spotify.
They've created proprietary podcasts, which you can only listen to on Apple's podcast player. So if you subscribe to a premium podcast, you couldn't then listen to that on Overcast, for example. You have to listen to that in Apple Podcast. Mm-hmm. And they could have solved that if they had chosen to, because, another way you can subscribe to podcasts is obviously with Patreon. And if you subscribe to a podcast on Patreon, you get a unique RSS URL that is just for you. And then you could use that URL on any podcast player you want.
Including Apple's now.
If Apple wanted to be saintly, is enable you to purchase it in their app, but give you a unique URL which you could use in another app as well.
Well, it's not even saintly, is it? It makes sense. I use Overcast. I don't use the podcast app, partly because I don't like purple very much. And there's way too much purple in there.
Yeah.
But if I could subscribe to a show just using the subscriptions in app,
Yeah.
and use that in Overcast, then I would. So Apple would be getting the cut instead of Patreon getting the cut. So it'd actually be in their interest to do that.
That's true.
I mean, pretty much that's everyone with an iPhone, though, right? I mean, if you've got an iPhone, they've got your credit card number, so you can buy stuff.
Yeah.
Pretty much. I mean, with some exceptions, but in general, that's the case.
So the last part of the story here, iTunes obviously started as one thing and then became something very different. iTunes actually started as a MP3 jukebox app is what it was. It was just an app that only ran on a Mac and it enabled you to play MP3 files.
And it was really good. It was excellent.
But over the years, Apple larded it up with more and more functionality. And when iPod and then iPhone came out, it became the admin software for managing your devices as well, which is such a different functionality from a music player. You know, iTunes was basically Apple's e-commerce platform is what it became from its humble origin as an MP3 player.
Yeah, you could get iTunes gift cards was a thing.
Yeah. So there came a point at which this wonderful piece of software, iTunes, had become this appalling piece of bloatware. So at this point, Apple decided they had to break up these different functions that iTunes had into separate apps. I think it was 2012 on iPhone that they separated the podcast app from the music one.
Was it that long ago?
Yeah. That really brings us to the Apple of today. And I must say, I'm very fond of Apple's podcast app. I think it's a jewel of the Apple ecosystem. It comes out of that era when Apple was playing nice with open standards and open source. As you say, it gives to the community as much as it takes. It just feels like this is a part of Apple that still has a really positive vibe. I would say that their domination has shrunk, if anything, over the years. Obviously, when podcasting was initially introduced into iTunes, they owned almost 100% of the podcasting market, and they did for many years. And it's been progressively eroded ever since.
Where's the market share gone?
Well, Android would be part of it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Back in 2005, iTunes was on Windows and Mac,
Got it.
and there was an iPhone and Android.
The 25% that Apple has, that just means people using Apple products.
Or the Apple Podcast app.
Because you say 25% is through Apple's podcast app, but then there's a bunch of people using Overcast and other apps on Apple platforms too.
Yeah. So that's brought us up to date. We have Apple's podcast app today, and we have a very different Apple. Yeah, it's certainly the way that I see it is Apple Podcast is a nice holdout to an earlier era of Apple, my favorite era of Apple, actually, when it was really engaging with these new ideas in a very open and collaborative way. And when Steve Jobs was playing the word ass in his in his keynotes and making people titter, and when people were really figuring out how they could use these new technologies in innovative ways, and Apple was a part of that conversation. And before Apple moved into more of these proprietary ways that it has today, there's no way of knowing, for example, what Steve Jobs would have thought of Apple's business model today or the commission that it charges to app developers. We don't know. We can only speculate. But what we can see back in 2005 is there was a light touch that they had. It's really interesting, Charlie, listening to you talking about when Apple added podcasting to iTunes, and you only saw it as a positive, nice thing, an exciting thing that Apple was doing. I kind of miss that aspect of Apple. I think that was a time when Apple did things and everyone thought, oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And that does happen with Apple now, but not so much with them adopting and promoting platforms.
Remember when they made the iTunes Music Store, the MP3s, DRM free?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I mean, that would never happen now. I mean, like doing the streams, I guess, would be the equivalent now of making the Apple Music stream DRM free, which would be impossible.
Yeah. So for that reason, I have a huge fondness for Apple Podcasts because it has that wonderful lineage to its origins being in the sweet point of, I think, the greatest time, the most innovative time, the most community engaging time in Apple's history. So that's Apple Podcasts. What do you make of it, Charlie? What have we learned today?
Quite a lot. I mean, we've learned the history of podcasting,
Yeah.
which is always interesting to go back over. How it's founded on completely open technologies,
Yeah.
and how Apple didn't really ruin that. In fact, they kind of fostered it
Yeah.
in a rather altruistic way. And then even now, when it's trying to make money from this, it hasn't ruined it. It's actually improving it, as you said.
Yeah.
And also that the podcast app is not only like one of the apart from being too purple, it's not only one of the nicest apps, like you say. It's still being developed. They're still adding things to it. It's still in not particularly quickly, as is Apple's way. The lone podcasting app developer probably gets to do something every couple of years, but it's not clips, for example. It's not just something that they launch and then forget about.
Yeah.
The touch bar. It almost still seems that they don't quite know what to do with it. What to do with podcasting? It's like they see it as it's nothing. It's not harming them, and it's good to have it as a hedge against, especially now, against Spotify and other people who are trying to lock up podcasting.
Yeah.
It seems that even now Apple's not really in a rush to ruin it, or they just don't have any ideas of what they could do, or any ideas of how they could make more money on it without destroying the advantages that they have. I don't know. It's very interesting. That's the very interesting part of.
I think you're right that they continue to invest in it. Very recently, they added auto chapters. They added transcripts a couple of years ago. They've added some really nice features in quite recent times to their podcast app. So I think that they do see it as being strategically important, probably because in order to provide an alternative to Spotify, it needs to be there. If they want to sell Apple Music as an alternative to Spotify, then they need to provide an alternative to the podcasting bit. So I think you're right. It's a hedge against Spotify as well.
Yeah, I think it's one of the cases where there's strong established competition and new stuff coming out, new competition like Spotify podcasts, and Apple's having to compete, and it's making its product good, and it just shows that it's kind of withering quality in many places over in recent years. A lot is down to the lack of competition. I mean, the App Store and the app payments system and all of this stuff, the App Store's quite bad. And because there's no alternative. If there was, Apple could make it great. So, it's one of the cases where Apple shows what happens when it's got a bit of competition, and it's a positive for everyone, for them and for mostly though for the users.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Well, I think that's our Apple Core for today. Any final words? And if people want to connect with you online, how can they do that?
You can see my not very often updated blog at straightnofilter.com, and you can follow my retweets of amusing things on Mastodon, Mr. Charlie at indieweb.social. And just to say, I think this has been a really good episode. I've quite enjoyed it.
Oh, well, I'm very glad. I only serve to entertain you, Charlie.
Good. Oh, good. That's what you're there. That's how I view you.
And if you want to follow me, I'm on Blue Sky, grahambauer.bluesky.social. And if you want to check out the app that I've been working on for the last 6 months, which has kept me from...
Oh, yeah, it's really good. It's really good. Definitely check it out. If you're fit or not fit, if you want to be fit in the future, check out Reps and Sets.
If you want to get ripped, then my strength training app is completely free, and I will put a link to it in the show notes so you can download that. It's for iPhone, iPad, and Apple Watch. And that's it for this week. And until next time, we shall see you soon. Bye.